Hello, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us here today at Penobscot Marine Museum. We will be looking at some of the paintings from our collections of lumber schooners and one packet schooner. Lumber was stacked high on the Lizzie B Small here in this photograph. Because lumber floats, there's less worry about losing the cargo. Indeed, Lizzie D Small appeared on a list of casualties of vessels off Cape Cod from 1910, but the crew of 5 were all safe as well as the cargo. Lizzie D Small was built in 1866 and carried lumber along the Maine coast. The bark Harvard is an example of a ship where ports were cut right into the bow of the vessel to load wool into the hull. Then the ports were closed in with a doorway that was sealed with caulking. We have images of the captain's family in the cabin of the Harvard that we talked about in the very first Peek into Paintings, the episode titled Life at Sea. The children who were traveling on the vessel at the time with the lumber report that the lumber which the Harvard picked up in Singapore was infested with scorpions. Luckily, that isn't an issue with wood cut in Maine. Edward Dyer Peters of Blue Hill changed the lumber trade in New England. Rather than sending loads of lumber to Boston on speculation, Peters established an office in Boston where he took lumber orders to send back to his partners in Ellsworth. In other words, his business was more like what we would recognize as a wholesale supplier today. Peters commissioned Fitz Henry Lane to paint one of the schooners that made his business possible. Fitz Henry Lane came up from Boston on trips to Castine and poked about in a small boat looking for attractive Maine marine scenes to paint. By 1850, when this painting was made, Lane's reputation was already established as one of the best marine painters in New England. You can see the lumber once again piled very high. The crew stood right on top of the pile to work the ship. And you can see here, they placed a lookout in the bow because they couldn't see over the big, huge pile of wood. There is a coasting schooner on the right over here. And on the left is a fishing schooner. If this image is depicting Gloucester, which our curator Sipperly Good thinks it might be, then this fishing schooner is probably headed for the Grand Banks. Sipperly also says that this little boat in the front here has a spritsail. Charles K Buckley was a 3-masted schooner out of Elizabeth, New Jersey. It was built in Millbridge, Maine in 1890 by Austin Dyer. I will read some parts of the report of the wreck of the Buckley from the Life-Saving Station report. This contemporary account was written for an audience of trained rescue workers, so the writer never explains how the breeches buoy is intended to work. The survivors on board the ship ought to have made the line fast somehow to some part of the ship. Once that was done, they would have been able to, one at a time, come ashore in a kind of sling suspended from the line by block and tackle, almost like a zip line. One thing to note about this image, usually for these videos, I restrict myself to images from our museum's collection. This painting by Winslow Homer is not in our collection, but it was too good an illustration of the breeches boy not to include it. I don't have a painting of the Buckley, but I have a painting of another schooner in distress, the Julia and Mary. So here are parts of the report of the Buckley. The Buckley, stranded on the Jersey shore, while on her way from Jacksonville, Florida to New York with a cargo of lumber. She carried a crew of 7 men, including her master. The master's wife was also on board. A gale blew with steadily increasing force. With his head sails and topsails blown away, the master decided to drop anchor and try to ride it out in the open. The wind was blowing at 88 miles. After the sailors had partaken of a cheerless supper, 2 or 3 of them climbed up one of the violently swaying masts to repair a topsail. While they were engaged at this task, the master called to them that the vessel was drifting and ordered them down. When it appeared that she would strike the beach, someone suggested that a fire signal be lighted. The crew procured a mattress from the cabin, soaked it in kerosene, and set it ablaze. The signal was immediately discovered by a surfman covering the patrol south from the Monmouth Beach station, and was promptly replied to by him with a flare. Meanwhile, the vessel continued to drag before the wind. They would soon be hard and fast in the breakers. It was while the schooner hastened thus to her doom, her master now permitted his wife, the mate, his brother, and 2 seamen to put off in a boat. The schooner's decks were piled high with lumber. This, the constant bombardment of the seas, had gradually loosened, and some of it had worked free by now and begun to thrash about, making the decks very unsafe. The idea of launching a boat was the mate's. The master was of the opinion that all hands would be better to remain by the vessel, but the first officer overcame his objections. The boat was accordingly launched on the lee side of the schooner, with the master's wife, the mate, and 2 sailors on board. Martinson also got into the boat, but before it rode free, he climbed back into the schooner, declaring to the master his determination to stick to the vessel until the last plank is gone. A giant comber plumped down upon it and blotted the small boat out. In the dim light thrown over the schooner's stern by a ship's lantern, the master witnessed the catastrophe and realized that he had lost a wife and a brother, as well as 2 seamen. The schooner struck. The seas beat against and over her with redoubled fury, carrying away much of what remained of her exposed load in a destroying avalanche that demolished the house and bulwarks and worked general havoc above deck. As there was no longer any place below where the 4 men that remained on board might be out of immediate danger, all hands now sought safety on the Mizzenboom. They had scarcely attained this refuge when a report of a gun was heard from the beach, 200 or more yards distant, and a line fell across the boom's outer end. Looking shoreward, they could see glimmering lights of houses and street lamps, and a crowd of persons assembled abreast of the vessel, which told them that they had stranded near some town. They surmised that the line was designed to play a part in the rescue, but to their misfortune, they did not know how to turn it to best account. The master, who was nearest the mast when the line fell, called out the inquiry, "What does this line mean? For us to get it and jump off?" On being assured by Martinson, wrongly, of course, that it was for that purpose, he scrambled over the 3 sailors and got hold of it. Then he rose to his feet and balanced himself on his unstable support while he threw off his oilskins. As he was in the act of securing the line, however, a sea leapt up and sent him headlong to the deck. Martinson, who was the only one of the sailors left that understood English, called to him to climb up again, but received no answer. A moment later, a big mass of lumber, impelled with terrible swiftness by a boarding sea, tore loose the lashings of the Mizzenboom, turning the big horizontal pole into a veritable engine of destruction. As it now began to swing to and fro to the roll of the vessel, on the first of its destroying trips round, as it pivoted against the mast, it smashed a section of ship's rail into kindling wood. Then suddenly above the roar of the elements, there smote the ears of the men in the rigging the agonizing cry, "Oh my God, it has taken my leg off." The boom in its sweep had caught and mortally injured the master before he could regain the rigging. The sailors could afford him no aid, for they too were in imminent danger of death in that seething hell of lumber-filled water below, as was soon to be shown. Very shortly, another towering sea leapt up over the boom and plucked Martinson from his perch. This sea evidently carried the master overboard, for he was not afterwards seen. Martinson thought his hour also had come, but in a moment he found his feet on the deck. He lost no time in climbing aloft again. The sea that tore Martinson from the boom also reached his 2 shipmates. When he regained his position aloft, he beheld one of them suspended helplessly, head and feet downward, from the peak halyard block where the sea had thrown him. The other sailor also had been knocked from the boom, and in falling had been swept under some lumber. Martinson did not see him again. In the survivor's account of the events aboard ship, he states that about this time he began to feel scared and climbed far enough up the mast to get a hold. Martinson says he held on to the mast for what seemed like a very long time, the while watching the swaying foremast and mainmast and expecting them momentarily to topple over. Suddenly, foremast, mainmast, and mizzenmast, all 3 came crashing down, Martinson along with the wreckage. Third line, fired shortly from the beach with accurate aim, fell squarely across his shoulder. He grasped it. The nearly exhausted sailor fastened the line about him and waited until the deck below and the water alongside appeared for the moment free of moving wreckage. When the chance seemed propitious, he slid quickly down and with a shout leapt into the sea. I came in very nicely until I neared the shore, when I was dragged under some wreckage. The sea washed the lumber away. Then I was dragged over some more lumber. It nearly finished me. Except in the case of Martinson, the efforts made by the lifesavers were of no avail, for the reason, already intimated, that nobody on board was acquainted with the method of performing a rescue with the breeches buoy. The movements of the lifesavers upon this occasion were seriously hampered by the crowd of curious persons, estimated at 1,000 or more, that had assembled on the beach to see the shipwrecked crew taken off. Many of the bystanders seemed to doubt the ability of the lifesavers to handle the situation alone, judging by their volubility of suggestion and their actions. The first, the corps might have endured with patience and in silence, but the onlookers also got in their way, insisted on handling their lines, stood in front of the line-throwing gun, and otherwise retarded the work in hand, all regardless of the pleadings, warnings, and threats of the lifesavers. Finally, by a miracle, the man was dragged from the water. And that was the story of the Buckley. The sailor Martinson was the only survivor. This painting that you've been looking at is of the schooner Julia and Mary, built in Hamden in Maine in 1848 and sailed down the coast to New York and back, a Bangor sailing packet. In 1878, the crew anchored the schooner off Cape Cod Beach to shelter from a hurricane, but the anchor cable snapped. The steamer Cimbria picked up the crew from the sinking vessel, and all were rescued. Thank you again so very much for joining us here today at Penobscot Marine Museum. Thank you to our members and donors. This programming has been brought to you in part by the National Endowment for the Humanities, Exploring the Human Endeavor. Until next time, take care.